In Northern Ireland, the latest Orange Day parade, one of the colourful marches that have traditionally celebrated the anniversaries of famous Protestant victories over Catholics throughout Ireland's violent past. In years gone by, the Orange Day parades have been reminders of the dominance of the Protestant majority, but not anymore. For the past 10 years, that dominance has been fiercely challenged by the Catholic minority. It's been a decade of despair in which Britain and its troops have been increasingly involved. The latest parade deteriorated into scenes of violence, a picture that's become only too familiar in Northern Ireland during the last 10 years. British troops back away. Their role is to defend the peace, protect the innocent, but it's a thankless and seemingly endless task. A British politician recently said that the people of Northern Ireland ache for a return to normality, yet riots like this go on. There have been outbreaks of violence in Northern Ireland for over a century, but the present unrest is the longest period in that bloody history. It goes back to 1968, and this is how it all began. A march in Londonderry by the Civil Rights Association, a Catholic group protesting against what it saw as intolerable discrimination. Their campaign served notice on the Protestant majority and the British government that Catholics were no longer willing to be treated as a downtrodden minority. It set the scene for what was to be a long-running tragedy with a cast literally of thousands. Among the leading players, Captain Terence O'Neill, then Northern Ireland Premier. As a moderate, he agreed in principle to Catholic demands. But many Protestants saw the campaign as a cover for sedition aimed at forcing a union with the Irish Republic to the south. The strength of this feeling forced O'Neill from office in April 1969. His successor was Major James Chichester Clark, whose problem was still how to satisfy his supporters in the Unionist Party without provoking a violent reaction from the Catholics. It proved an impossible task. One of the most outspoken Ulster loyalists was the Reverend Ian Paisley, a militant unionist who began to mobilize extreme Protestant opinion in a series of marches and meetings, regaling his followers with his own brand of oratory.
The Ulster, where the loyalists shall walk, and shall walk without hindrance. And I'm pledging you, my friend, today that we're going to carry this battle to every end of this province until the day shall come when the Union Jack shall fly on every street and on every road.
Ian Paisley's counterpart on the Catholic side was Bernadette Devlin, a university student and civil rights activist. She was just as vociferous as Paisley and as energetic in organizing her followers. Bernadette Devlin had helped to found the Socialist People's Democracy movement in support of Catholic civil rights, and she now became a rallying point for extreme Catholic opinion. Like Mr. Paisley, the young Miss Devlin went on to become a member of Parliament at Westminster.
Another 50 years of unionist stranglehold on our people, that the unionist rich, the unionist...
Catholic grievances centred on voting rights, jobs and housing. Many Catholic families lived in overcrowded conditions in houses that should have been condemned as slums. Often the men in the family were out of work. It was a matter of great bitterness to Catholics that the allocation of new council houses favoured Protestants. Other demands were for the disbanding of the auxiliary police force known as the B Specials. Catholics saw the force as a tool of Protestant repression. They also called for the repeal of the Special Powers Act, under which police could enter houses and detain suspects without trial. On August the 12th, 1969, sectarian violence reached new heights after Protestants staged an annual march commemorating their resistance of a Catholic siege almost 2 centuries before. In the darkness, Londonderry began to resemble a city at war. Petrol bombs put whole districts ablaze. Firemen couldn't keep pace with the outbreaks. The rioting continued for 4 days, and the Northern Ireland government had to admit the situation had run out of control. At the request of the Northern Ireland government, 1,000 British troops arrived on August the 15th. In Londonderry, the troops were greeted as saviours by the Catholics in the Bog Side district, though the purpose of the army units was not to take sides, but to keep the warring communities from each other's throats. After Londonderry, the conflict spread like a forest fire across Ulster. Whole streets were devastated as Catholic and Protestant communities fought out battles across dividing lines and behind barricades. In the first 2 days of violence after the Londonderry riot, 10 civilians were killed, nearly 150 injured, and countless more were made homeless. Much of the trouble was caused by the ghetto-type separation of the communities. Predominantly Catholic towns have strictly segregated pockets of Protestants, and vice versa. Not only towns and districts are divided, the divisions reach down to individual roads, where one end may be Catholic, the other Protestant. In Northern Ireland, it's religion that decides where a man works, where his children go to school, where his family lives. Though the boundaries are invisible, they're as impenetrable as concrete walls. By the end of 1970, there were 11,000 British troops in Northern Ireland, and the sectarian hatred had also increased in pitch. So deep and so bitter was it that some Catholic extremists ordered Protestants to leave their houses or be burned out. To prevent them falling into Catholic hands, the Protestants burned their homes themselves. Such was the scale of the devastation that schools were turned into reception centres for families. Classrooms became hostels, and help was given to find permanent shelter. Some families fled to refugee camps in the Irish Republic, others stayed with friends, but few dared to return to their old home districts. Much of the violence in these early days began between sectarian street gangs, but behind it, and coming increasingly into the spotlight, were the men of the IRA, totally dedicated to the overthrow of the Protestant majority and the British presence. The exploits of the IRA began to hit the headlines, though they remained a very secret organization. In 1969, the IRA split into 2 groups, the official wing, largely political, and these men, the provisionals, relying wholly on force to sever Northern Ireland's connections with Britain. It was the provisionals who declared war on the British Army, killing the first British soldier in February 1971. The provisionals were matched by Protestant hardmen, the Ulster Defence Association. The UDA was a private Protestant army. By 1972, Northern Ireland's towns had been barricaded into Protestant and Catholic strongholds, each with its own garrison of UDA or provisional IRA men. The UDA marched, trained and recruited quite openly, and boasted of 25,000 men ready to take up arms, with another 50,000 in reserve. 1972 was proved to be the worst of the last 10 bitter years in Northern Ireland, with 467 killed and 3,500 injured. It started badly. On the last Sunday in January, Catholic civil rights marchers defied a government ban on parades and came into violent conflict with British troops in the centre of Londonderry. The rioting became so bad that paratroops were finally sent through the barricades to restore order. Shooting began, and within half an hour, 13 civilians, all of them Catholics, were shot dead by British troops. The troops claimed they'd shot back in self-defense at snipers who'd started the shooting, and a judicial inquiry later cleared them of the charge that they'd fired indiscriminately into a fleeing crowd. But the findings simply weren't believed by the Catholics of Londonderry. For them, the troops were murderers and the dead were martyrs. And the events of that confused afternoon became indelibly engraved on Catholic consciences in the phrase, Bloody Sunday. Bloody Sunday was perfect ammunition for those accusing Britain of running a repressive regime, and more was to come. For March saw Northern Ireland's Parliament suspended and its provincial government dismissed. Rule instead came from Westminster, and Mr. William Whitelaw was given the job of running Ulster as Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. He toured Catholic areas and heard at first hand the views of its citizens. One thing the tour confirmed was the Catholics' total opposition to the policy of internment without trial, which had been introduced in August 1971. The decision to detain IRA suspects without trial had been made because the authorities found it impossible to get witnesses to give evidence against them. Mr. Whitelaw bent to Catholic opinion and began releasing the detainees. Mr. Whitelaw began by releasing 50 of the detainees each week. He had no doubt that the policy would pay off because he'd been told there could be no political solution to the Northern Ireland problem as long as Catholics were being detained without trial. Mr. Whitelaw's dilemma, though, was that the more he won the trust of the Catholics, the more he generated the hostility of the Protestants. And so 1972 wore on with more and more terrorism and bombings. May of 1973 saw the people of Ulster voting for an assembly in which power would be shared between Protestants and Catholics. It was aimed at giving the Catholics a bigger voice in the running of the province. The Protestants took a lot of persuading, but the elections went ahead. In December, the British government made another attempt to bring about a peaceful solution. At Sunningdale in Berkshire, talks were held to try to find a formula for devolving power once more to the province. The idea again was to share power between the Protestants and Catholics, but a vital ingredient was the Council of Ireland, a link between Belfast and Dublin. Many ordinary people, sickened by bloodshed, desperately wanted a solution, but the power-sharing executive looked doomed. The gulf between the Protestants and Catholics was, as always, too wide to bridge. When the executive met, the politicians' differences erupted into scuffles.
Come on, right back. He never failed there! And these red caps! What are you doing with that man? What are you doing with that? Right out of the road, please. Come on.
As the politicians bickered, the terrorists carried on their campaign with ruthless efficiency. The 1,000th Ulster death was recorded by a pacifist priest carrying out a one-man demonstration to remind both communities how costly their hatred had become. The final nail in the coffin of power sharing was also about to be hammered home. A general strike was called by the Ulster Workers' Council, a group of hardline loyalist organizations who first used intimidation and later persuasion to close and paralyze all the province's essential services. The executive called on the British government to use soldiers to break the strike, but the response was too weak and too late. Eventually, the Protestant majority on the executive voted to negotiate with the strikers. The British government rejected the vote and the executive resigned. The strikers had destroyed power sharing and the province went back under direct rule from London. After that victory for the Protestants, the IRA took its campaign to mainland Britain with a series of bomb attacks beginning at Westminster itself. In June 1974, 11 people were injured when a bomb exploded at Westminster Hall. The message was clear. The Northern Ireland problem would not go away, and those who sat in Parliament could not assume it could be contained on the other side of the Irish Sea. The Tower of London was hit the same day. 1 person was killed and 42 injured. The choice of targets, British institutions, also made its point. Mainland Britons who'd become complacent about the continual violence in Northern Ireland suddenly experienced the horror of bombings striking terrifyingly close to home. The year's most stunning attack in England came in October. A packed public house used by servicemen at Guildford in Surrey was the target. Though the bomb was only small in size, its impact in the tiny confines of the bar was terrifying. 5 people died in the explosion, which almost demolished the building, and 49 more people were injured. The bombers moved next to Birmingham, killing 20 more people and injuring scores in city centre pubs. In all, 40 people were killed and 10 times that number injured in the wave of explosions. And throughout, the IRA call was for Britain to withdraw from Northern Ireland, a solution that a growing number of mainland Britons were beginning to favour. As the pressure to withdraw continued, the British government made yet another attempt at a political solution. At elections in May 1975, voters chose delegates to a convention planning a new constitution for the province. Protestant members dominated, and the convention eventually recommended what was, in effect, a return to the situation before direct rule. Britain couldn't accept this, and the convention was adjourned. Political failure meant the violence continued, but it wasn't all completely hopeless. 3 children died at this spot during a battle between British soldiers and IRA gunmen. The children weren't caught in the crossfire. They died not from bullets, but when one gunman's car was shot at and crashed into them. The blow was an especially bitter one, for the children were all of the same family, the Maguire family. The people who felt most closely for the Maguires' bereavement were the countless ordinary mothers and wives who each risked similar heartbreak every day. The deaths of the children revolted the women. Despite threats from sectarian extremists, they tried to salvage some vestige of purpose from the otherwise pointless deaths of the young Maguires. They started a movement for peace. Amazingly, the women who joined ignored their sectarian loyalties. Catholic and Protestant for once united. Betty Williams and Mairead Corrigan emerged as leaders of the women's peace movement, and thousands rallied round them. For week after week, they braved insults, threats, and mobs, marching for peace not only in Ireland but abroad. In 1976, a Norwegian newspaper gave them a peace prize. further recognition followed, and so did donations to help set up safe places for children to play, even factories to bring in jobs and help rid Northern Ireland of some of its social deprivation. Apart from raising funds, the peace movement also raised morale. For many ordinary Ulster folk have no stomach lift for terrorism. The peace movement proved that families are more important than feuds, and that it was better to bury differences than bury loved ones. Another general strike, masterminded by unionists and led by Ian Paisley, took place in 1977. This time, though, the strike failed. And it failed for two reasons that might be encouraging to all those hoping for peace in the province. For one thing, Protestants, tired of extremist action, were far less willing to support it than they had been in 1974. The other factor, the Royal Ulster Constabulary. The RUC had always been hated by the Catholics because of its strictly Protestant nature, but reforms by the British government aimed to make the RUC less partisan and more acceptable as an even-handed force for law and order. When the RUC acted against the Protestant strikers, it was seen as major confirmation that the reforms were working. During the past troubled decade, it's been the British soldier who's had the thankless task of standing between the extremists. When they first moved in during the '69 riots, the contingent was 1,000 strong. By 1972, that number had risen to 20,000, and the men who'd been hailed as saviours had become hated. Spat on by children, stoned by women, and shot at by gunmen of both sects, the Britons soldiered on regardless. Allegations of torture were made, and several investigations were carried out. Some troops were found guilty of overzealous interrogation. What nobody denies, though, is the almost impossible task they were given, and it's certainly true that they're now able to adopt a much lower profile in the province.
Have you a driving license or anything on you? Any form of identification?
By last year, the overall security position had improved enough for Queen Elizabeth to include a visit to the province in her Jubilee tour. As sovereign of the whole British Isles, she was expected to visit Northern Ireland. But had the Jubilee come a year earlier, the violence would have made that unthinkable. Even so, security precautions were discreet but strict. The Queen travelled by helicopter because it was thought that the helicopter flight would be potentially less dangerous in this case than a car journey. In fact, the visit passed off peacefully, and the Unionists had every opportunity to show their loyalty to the Crown.
We want the Queen! We want the Queen! We want the Queen!
Of course, it's loyalty to the British Crown that's at the very centre of the Northern Ireland problem. There are many Britons who would like to see the troops pulled out, leaving the Northern Irish to settle their differences themselves. But one of the major fears the British government has had in the past is that the Protestant majority might take the opportunity to wipe out their Catholic enemies once and for all. But it's the growing role of the RUC as a peacekeeping force and its greater reputation for reliability that makes the risk of a future Protestant backlash far less likely. Another hopeful sign, Belfast's new Lord Mayor, David Cook. Not only is Mr. Cook young and forward-looking, but for the first time in the council's history, he's a mayor who does not belong to the Protestant majority party. And indeed, his wife's actually a Catholic. Growing confidence in industry and a returning trickle of overseas investment are other signs of hope. Of course, optimism about an end to the Troubles has to be put into context. There have still been over 500 shootings so far this year, and economically there's still a long way